George III. Now, I think size, what I'm trying to get to, is that I think size alone, circulation alone, is not necessarily the only or the most significant index of importance, of impact. And I think that, you know, I spoke earlier about the way the power structure doesn't think that way about these small-scale media, but I think there are other indices. I mean, maybe the power structure could be wrong, but I think there are other indices, because when these media really become important around a particular issue, it is not just those people who read them, but those people who talk to others and others and others in a chain, who will, in a sense, allow that information to mobilize them. Let me give you a very specific and recent example. There's an outfit called Public Data Access, and what they did was they got information from central government, federal government, and put it on floppy disks about the location of toxic waste dumps. And they found in the process of doing this that most toxic waste dumps are near ethnic minority communities, geographically speaking. And they put the information not on some national piece of, some national document. They put it deliberately on local documents, because it's in local areas that people are most likely to get up some kind of upset and some movement against the toxic waste dump. People in Austin are not going to demonstrate against the toxic waste dump in Montana, and vice versa. But the size and the localism of this particular piece of information don't give you any real measure of its potential impact, at least, at the level of a given community which is faced with this particular toxic waste dump, which is threatening the lives and health of the children and adults in the neighborhood. So size for me is not irrelevant, but it's only one index of significance.
How do you sort of appraise the role or the function of community radio in the alternative media spectrum?
Well, again, I'm glad you raised it, because it's quite right. It's the one medium we kind of left off to date. I think community radio is real important. I think that, again, the merit of radio is that it's cheap. It's accessible, therefore, to a lot of people without extensive resources. And I think that community radio has a major part to play, both in delivering news and also in playing, as we know, radio is thought of as purely music these days, but also in playing, you know, alternative rock and alternative music, which doesn't get on the main system.
In fact, you studied some alternative radio in Europe that's actually very radical. Mm-hmm. Some of it is low-power radio, where individuals just get a transformer out and shoot out whatever political messages or whatever music or talk they want to engage in. Can you give some examples of that sort of really radical radio that we really haven't seen anything quite like this in the U.S., as far as I know, at least?
Okay, the main examples from Europe are now perhaps, you know, sort of have gone by a bit in time. I mean, the key places were France and Italy. Initially Italy. Both had a very strict law about who could broadcast. And basically what happened was that first in Italy and later in France, people just decided to break that law. They saw it as a ridiculous law, a law which simply gave the government of the day kind of free rein just to express its own views to the public. And so they capitalized on public discontent and broke the law in that situation. And eventually the law was seen to be an ass, in this regard at least, and was changed. But for a while there really was an explosion of independent activity on the airwaves. And all kinds of groups would be involved in the social movements of the day, be they anti-nuclear or be they feminist movements, or a particular community which was suffering a particular problem, or immigrants from the third world, immigrant workers from the third world. A variety of these interests could find voice on these radios, which otherwise the airways were totally closed to them.
Likewise, in Japan, there's some examples of low-power community radio. We have a friend, Tetsu Kogawa, who's specialized in this. And evidently in Japan, they got some very cheap low-power transmitters that basically just began a conversation in someone's home or maybe in a community center, and would invite people to come and join in the participation in the discussion. And so a lot of people left their houses and actually became active participants in alternative media as opposed to passive recipients. This became so popular that Sony started to market these low-power transmitters. There were thousands of them all over Japan, and they were very, very popular, and this became a threat to the government of Japan that carefully controlled the mainstream media and didn't like these alternative media, which, needless to say, were very critical of the government and were articulating views that had never been heard before in Japanese society. So they cracked down on them pretty fiercely. So this is no more. I've heard some stories about low-power radio in the U.S. of this nature. Do you have any idea of the extent or what type there is? There's Pacifica Radio, which is a national alternative radio network, but what else is there in terms of alternative radio in the U.S.?
Well, I forget exactly how many stations there are. I certainly runs into quite a few hundred across the country. There's usually one at least in any major urban center, sometimes more. Here in Austin, of course, is KAZI, fulfills that role. Pacifica is not a low-power station, of course. I mean, Pacifica stations broadcast on sort of regular wattage. Low power basically means that the signal won't usually go very far. And I remember Tetsuo Kagawa that you're referring to standing on the roof of the house that I lived in Brooklyn 2 or 3 years back and broadcasting to the house of another friend of mine 2 blocks away, Juan Flores. And we were then picked up by some other people in the neighborhood who phoned in and said, hey, what's going on? This is amazing. So it happens. And the transistor, I mean, I can show it since we have a screen. The transmitter is literally this big. I mean, about the size of a remote or something for your TV. It's real small. There's a lot of, I'm not a technologist or an engineer, but there's a lot of fetishization about how complicated some of this stuff is. And it really is not. You don't need a whole lot of wisdom or electronic engineering knowledge to be able to put one of these things together.
John, when we're talking about the future of media in this society, we need to begin to theorize computers, do we not? Because this is a powerful new source of information, and it's again something that is controlled by the corporate mainstream that can afford these expensive databases or these less expensive like CompuServe and some of the Dialog, some of the other services. What is the realm of alternative media in the field of computers? Where do you get alternative information vis-a-vis computers, and how does this work?
Well, I mentioned earlier a couple of these outfits which have used one or other aspects of the power of the computer to communicate horizontally instead of vertically, PeaceNet and public data access. And I think that the possibilities here are very considerable as simple microcomputers, personal computers, desk computers come down in price. For as long as they continue to allow us to use the telephone lines without putting some extra charge on, then at that point communication by these means, it's like having a data telephone. And communication by these means is cheap and it's very quick and it's very easy. And so I think the opportunities there are considerable, and there is an enormous amount of activity today by the citizenry on all kinds of bulletin boards and homemade databases of one kind or another. But again, as you say, if you want access to the heavy-duty information and private information about corporations and the rest of it, then at that point, the same kind of privileged access to media and communications and information still operates on computer networks as in any other sphere. And that again is something which should be a battle for us to begin to try to democratize those sources of information.
And probably one of the most successful alternative sources of information is PeaceNet. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. PeaceNet was begun in California a few years back now, and its objective was to provide a network for peace activists in this country to communicate with each other, to exchange information about what was going on. It later brought in another network called EchoNet, as you see from the name, ecological concerns. And now it has numerous groups on every conceivable kind of political interest which run their own bulletin boards, and it's real cheap. It's only a few dollars a month to join up. and you can be plugged in not only nationally but now also internationally, because it connects up with a whole lot of similar networks in Europe and Australia and elsewhere. So it's a very exciting new development, and essentially all it means is that instead of hitting a few keys and calling up the file on your computer which you put there yesterday, you hit some different keys and you call up a file which may be located thousands of miles away and have been created by somebody else, and you can access that and you can see it on the screen, and if you want to print it out, you can print it out.
I continue to get information about the Gulf from the PeaceNet database. During the Gulf War, every day I would get alternative information that was typed in from Australia, from the Middle East, from Britain, from different alternative sources that gave a very different picture of the Gulf War than the mainstream media. And likewise on environmental issues, on feminist issues, and all over the world. In China, in Russia, you have people in these bulletin boards putting information in that's very different than what you get from the newspapers. So I think this is a very important source of alternative information for the future from these computer databases. I
agree, and it's also a medium of exchange. It's not only receiving that useful information, but it's also being able to give information, it's being able to ask people questions, it's being able to request information, exchange views, and so on. So it's, in principle, a dialogic form of communication, which, as you were saying, is the core of democracy.
In fact, it's an alternative form of democratic forum, right, where people debate these different issues. During the Gulf War, there was a Mideast Gulf Forum where people debated that issue. There's a Palestinian-Israeli forum where people give different opinions on this sort of thing. There was a presidential forum where people argued out the relative merits or demerits of Clinton, Perot, Bush, etc.
John, what is the future of radical media, particularly in relationship to society? In your book, you say that media communications is the fundamental element in the battle for power, and also power, culture, and communications are indissolubly linked. So those are pretty those are pretty significant things to do with media, and particularly alternative media.
Well, I think I also say somewhere there that alternative media flourish in the wastelands left by official media. And I see, for as long as official media and mainstream and established media fail to fulfill the objectives that they are supposed by the sort of the law, L-O-R-E, of our nation to fulfill. As long as they don't fulfill those, alternative media will continue to flourish, and they will continue to be extremely important. I think that the battle for power between the majority of the society and the minority which thinks it has the right to run the society is crucially waged in the field of communication. Because if the majority is dependent all the time on media run by and subservient to that minority, then our ability to know what each other thinks, to tap each other's wisdom, is going to be correspondingly constrained.
We've been talking about the alternative press. Let's take a sample of 3 news stories from the alternative press.
Recently, the city of Houston was granting all kinds of tax concessions and environmental concessions to a huge Taiwanese company which had gotten too dirty for Taiwan.
Oh my God.
So they were going to move to the U.S. because the Taiwanese, feeling prosperous enough, didn't want the company there polluting their environment. It was a huge chemical processing firm. So we're going to increasingly become like third world nations ourselves, willing to prostitute our own nation and our own health just to have a company relocate to U.S. shores.
And here are just some totally unrelated facts from the November issue of Mother Jones. The average cost to taxpayers of one inmate's high security imprisonment for 40 years in Texas is $750,000. The average cost of an execution trial and appeal in Texas is $2.3 million. The rank of Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, and Texas in the number of executions of juvenile offenders is 1, 2, 3, and 4. That was Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, and Texas. The average annual child support payment in 1978 was $3,305. The payment now is $2,995. The percentage of Americans who think Republicans have a majority in Congress is 35%. And the percentage of U.S. households that did not purchase a book in 1991 was 60%.
People who are interested in foreign and domestic policy should look first to see where it all started out from. For foreign affairs, you should look at the Council on Foreign Relations. For domestic affairs, perhaps to the Brookings Institution or to the Committee for Economic Development. The Brookings Institution was a place where all the Great Society programs were hatched, which Johnson and LBJ later got credit for. The Council on Foreign Relations has study groups which determine what U.S. foreign policy should be into the future, and lo and behold, it always seems to work out that way. Well, you may not have heard much about the Committee for Economic Development, but it's the equivalent of the CFR, but only for domestic subjects. And here's a way that you can check to see how effective these elite organizations are. In 1962, the CED, the Committee for Economic Development, released a study called an Adaptive Program for Agriculture, and it called for moving 1/3 of the farm population out of farming within 5 years. There were just too many farmers, they said, and we wanted to turn it over to big agribusiness, our buddies. Now, the CED is heavily populated not only by elite members of the power structure, but also with people representing the big agribusiness organizations. So what the CED recommended was to immediately reduce price supports for wheat, cotton, rice, and other grains. Now, what has happened is that the U.S. policy has actually gone along and followed the general direction which the Committee for Economic Development desired. The government-mandated farm prices steadily slipped further and further below the cost of production, which forced farmers into bankruptcy. Since that time, it pushed 1.5 million farmers off of the land. Roughly 25% of the farms produced 80% of all farm products at that time. Now, displaced farmers, where did they go? Well, they poured into urban labor markets, depressing real wages, undermining labor unions, and which was another goal of the Committee for Economic Development. So things just don't happen. As FDR said, if something happens, you can bet your life it was planned that way.
And that's the end of this Alternative Views.
Frequently hear from viewers who request a list of news publications which we use on Alternative Views, and also a reading list for U.S. power structure in the mass media. If you would like to have these, send a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas 78713.